I don't think got any of that. So I'm gonna put the final answer. If you need to go back and see how we got that, I will do that. So for 6, we have y equals -17/6 plus 1/2 x or plus x over 2, either or. Do we need to see that one? Yes. If we were getting y by itself, we need to get rid of the x term. And then divide each thing by -6. So the y is left here. The negative you would bring up. Put it in the front or in the numerator, and then this one you can reduce and it would become positive. Then for 7, the final answer was C, not D. C equals G minus AB all over D. Do we need to see that one? So if we're trying to get C by itself, we would get rid of the other term that has nothing to do with C. And then move it to the other side, but not actually combine them because they're not like terms. And divide both sides by D. Go on to the next page. Find any questions on this page you want to see, go over, have questions about. Jasmine? 6. Circle them all, and then we'll go back. Any others? Go ahead, Hila. 3. Five. And then 1. All right, so let's start with those. Starting with number 3. We are trying to solve for f, get f by itself. Right now, f is inside the parentheses. So we need to get rid of this 5/9 before we do anything else. How would we do that? What do we think? Okay. So that's one option, but if we distributed, we may or may not end up with a nice number here. And then we're gonna eventually have to still get rid of that 5/9 later with that. So we could do that instead. Take it and flip it. And multiply that on both sides. Multiply by the reciprocal is what that's called. Because then the 5/9 and the 9/5 cancel. This becomes 9/5 C. And now we can drop the parentheses. So then our next step would be what? Add 22 to both sides. Some of these are real life formulas or equations, like this one is how to convert Celsius and Fahrenheit back and forth. So now we have our equation for F. We wouldn't need to do anything else. That is our answer. Do we have any questions on that one? Okay. Number 4, what are we trying to get by itself? M. Right now, M is being divided by V, so we need to get rid of V. How would we do that? Multiply by V on both sides. Because then the V's would cancel. And I have your notes if you want to get. So the V's would cancel on the one side. We'd be multiplying V and V together. Whether you put VD or DV doesn't matter. And that would be our equation. We don't have anything else to do. Questions on that one? For number 5, gonna be similar. B is being added to C. It's also being divided by D. We have to get rid of D before we can do anything else. So multiply D on both sides. But when you do that, think about B plus C like in parentheses. We're not actually going to distribute. We're just multiplying so that the D cancel. Again, it doesn't matter if you put AD or DA, they're both the same. And then our last step. Subtract C. The DA minus C equals B would be our final answer. Questions on that one? For number 6, we need to get B sub 1, B1, whatever you want to call that, by itself. So this is similar to number 3, where we had to get the F out of the parentheses. So what would we do first? Take the reciprocal of 1/2 and flip it. Multiply by 2 over 1 or just 2 on both sides. So we have 2A equals H times B1 plus B2 in parentheses. So now we have to get rid of the H before we can do anything else. How would we do that? Divide both sides by H. We have 2A over H equals, now we can drop our parentheses, B1 plus B2. And then get rid of B2. So again, as you look at these equations, they really don't make sense. But if we had the information to put in here, we could figure out what B1 actually equals, but we're not actually looking for that. Right, questions on that one? Look at the next page and find any questions you want to see, go over, have questions about. Lacey, one. Any others, Caleb? Four, Dylan? Seven. Okay, I'm gonna say that 5 and 8 are similar, they're just solving for two different things. Any others? Mina? One, we have that. Alright, so let's start with number 1. If we are trying to solve this for t, and all of these are multiplying, we're gonna undo this by dividing everything at the same time. So P over IR equals T. Questions on that one? Number 4, we're trying to get M by itself. What would we get rid of first? The 2 by multiplying on both sides. We have 2K equals MV squared. Now, M and V are being multiplied, V is being squared. How would I get rid of V squared? What do we think? If we were looking for V, we'd have to get rid of M, and then yes, we take the square root, but we're not. How would we get rid of the V squared? Divided. And 2K over V squared equals M. If we had been asked to find V, then we would have divided both sides by M and taken the square root of the entire side to get V. Questions on that one? And then, so 7 is kind of like what I was just talking about. We need to get rid of pi, we need to get rid of the square. What would we do first? Jump. My pi symbols are not that great, so do yours however. And then to get r by itself? Not divide. We need to get rid of the square. How do we undo something that's squared? Square root. So now we would take the square root of both sides. The square and the square root would cancel. So we would just be left with, well, the square root of a over pi equals r. Notice that we haven't really done a whole lot of calculator things besides the one where we had to simplify. With the literal equations, this will be part of the non-calculator section. Yes. So this time we were trying to get r right. But the last time we were just trying to get m by itself. It doesn't matter if it's square. If it says v, then we have to get 5. All right. Do I want to do the last page? Not that important. On the very back, where you have blank space, I want you to write a couple of problems down. Give me 1 second so I can pull it out. Okay, it's I'm gonna read it also and rewrite it. So write this on the back, AX plus 3X equals BX plus 5. Yes. So when you get problems like this, you're gonna want to get all of the same variable on the same side. So usually they'll only have one variable, sometimes they'll have multiple. So in this case, we want to get this BX over here. So we're gonna subtract. So I'm gonna rewrite this, so we have AX plus 3X minus BX equals 5. This is going so slow, it's throwing me off. And when you see this, we want to get X by itself. But the only way to do that is if we took X out of each of them. So when you do this, think about this like we're undistributing. Later, we'll talk about this as happening, but we want to pull this X out of each of these. So normally when we distribute, we have like something outside of parentheses and we multiply it to everything and then it gets distributed to everything. We want to do the opposite. So if I put X out front, I'm taking it from everything that's there. So like I'm dividing this by X, so there would only be A left. I'm dividing this by X, so there would only be 3 left. And then I'm dividing this by X, so there'd only be minus B left. And then to get X completely by itself, we would divide that set of parentheses. On both sides. So then our final answer would be a fraction 5 over A plus 3 minus B. And all of your answers are going to look weird like that. Before we move on to another one, does anyone have questions on anything we just did? I can try. Yeah. So there'll be 2 types of examples. One where you have to move everything and then do the parentheses. One where there will already be parentheses and you have to kind of do it twice. Like this one. I'm going to rewrite this so you can see it. This is V times J plus Y in parentheses equals 61Y plus 82. Okay. So we are trying to get Y by itself. Right now we have one inside parentheses and one outside of the parentheses. In this case, we have to distribute first. That's supposed to be. So VJ plus VY equals 61Y plus 82. After you distribute is exactly like what we just did. You have to get all the Y's on the same side. Anything that's not a Y, we can move to the other side. So we can, it doesn't matter. I'm going to subtract 61Y. And then subtract VY. I'm sorry, VJ is what I meant. I did that backwards. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna put that here, not there. So that on one side we'll have Vy minus 61y. And on the other side, we'll have 82 minus Vj. Then just like before, we have to get the y's out of both of V and negative 61, so we're gonna like take it out. I'm gonna write this over here. So that only V and negative 61 are left. And then the rest. 82 minus Vj. And then our last step would be to divide what's inside the parentheses. So this would be a fraction. 82 minus Vj all over V minus 61. Only thing that might vary between those two different types is you might have 3 things or 2, depending. You might start off with parentheses, you might not. You might have 3 things inside parentheses, you might not. It depends. Almost all of these are going to end up in fractions, so. Do we have any questions about this? So this is the one assignment that is due on Tuesday, but you could do it right now and not have to worry about it next week. Right? So I'm gonna pass out a review, and you can be working on any of these 3 things: the review, Khan Academy, or other problems from these notes. If you need my help with any of those, let me know.